Just over a century ago, China was being, quote, carved up like a birthday cake, humiliated, and labeled the sick man of Asia. Today, it is a global superpower that makes the West nervous. How did this happen? This is the story of the century of humiliation, the 100-year nightmare that drives everything Beijing does today. As the saying goes, the dragon was wounded, the dragon recovered, and the dragon remembers.
You know, every global power has its low point. But China's wasn't just a dip. It was a complete, shattering freefall. And it didn't just break a nation. It ended up reshaping the entire modern world. So today, we're diving into the story of China's century of humiliation, a period of pain that honestly explains so much about the superpower we see today.
I mean, it's a staggering question, right? How does a country that saw itself as the literal center of the universe get brought to its knees, carved up, and humiliated by pretty much the rest of the world? If you really want to understand modern China, this is where you have to start.
So let's rewind the clock. We're going back to the early 1800s. And I want you to forget everything you know about China today. Because back then, they were without a doubt on top of the world.
So, under the Qing Dynasty, China wasn't just a major power. It was pretty much the power. We're talking about the largest, wealthiest, most populous empire on the entire planet. And get this, its economy was bigger than all of Europe's put together. The imperial court saw itself as the absolute pinnacle of civilization, and they looked at all foreigners as barbarians they had nothing to learn from. And that confidence, well, as we're about to see, it would prove absolutely fatal.
Okay, so this is where Great Britain enters the picture. And they had a big problem. A really big, really expensive thirst that was draining its entire economy.
And this, right here, perfectly sums up the issue. The British were absolutely obsessed with Chinese tea, importing millions and millions of pounds of it. But China? They didn't want British stuff. They wanted one thing, and one thing only: cold, hard silver. This created this huge trade deficit that was literally bleeding Britain's treasury dry. So Britain had to come up with a plan. And believe me, it was a dark one.
What was the plan? Well, Britain started growing massive amounts of opium in its colony India and then illegally smuggled it into China. This wasn't some small-time operation. This was, for all intents and purposes, a state-sponsored drug trafficking ring on an industrial scale. Soon, millions of Chinese people, from elites down to peasants, were hooked. Society started to unravel, and all that silver that was flowing into China, it started pouring right back out and into British pockets. The entire Chinese economy was just collapsing from the inside out.
Okay, so obviously the Chinese government knew it had to do something. In 1839, they sent this official, Lin Zexu, to shut the whole drug trade down. He even wrote this incredibly direct, desperate letter to Queen Victoria herself, basically pleading with her, but he got nothing, silence. So with his letter totally ignored, Commissioner Lin took matters into his own hands. He seized and publicly destroyed more than 1,000 tons of British-owned opium. And Britain's response? It wasn't to apologize or stop the drug trade. Nope. It was to declare war. A war to protect their drug money. And the first Opium War, well, it was a total rout, a complete mismatch. Yeah, China had way more soldiers, but Britain had the Industrial Revolution on its side. We're talking steamships and modern cannons against traditional Chinese swords and spears. It was quite literally like bringing a knife to a gunfight. So yeah, China lost, badly. But here's the thing, this defeat, it wasn't the end. Oh no, it was just the beginning. It was like Britain kicked the door down, and suddenly every other major power saw an open invitation to come in and take a piece.
What came next was a series of treaties that are now famously known as the unequal treaties, and for good reason. First up, the Treaty of Nanking. China is forced to give Hong Kong to Britain and pay a massive fortune in silver. Then, after another war, they're forced to legalize the very drug that started all this and pay even more. And finally, the Boxer Protocol in 1901 demanded a payment so huge it was more than the government's entire annual income. The country was literally being bled dry.
And this just shows you the feeding frenzy that happened. Once Britain showed China was vulnerable, everybody rushed in for a slice of the pie. You had the British and French burning down the magnificent Summer Palace, Russia just seizes huge chunks of land in the north, Germany, France, and a newly powerful Japan, they all carve out their own spheres of influence, controlling ports and railways and mines. China was basically becoming a colony in everything but name. And you have to get this wasn't just about losing a war or losing money. It was, as historian Stephen Platt puts it, a deep, profound psychological shattering. The whole idea of China being the untouchable, civilized center of the world, gone, utterly destroyed.
All of this humiliation just keeps building and building, leading to China's absolute lowest point. With its government totally crippled by outsiders, the country didn't just crack, it started to completely fall apart from the inside.
So in 1911, after ruling for centuries, the Qing Dynasty is finally over. It collapses. But what came next wasn't freedom or a stable republic. It was pure, unfiltered chaos. This period is known as the warlord era, and China basically became a failed state, torn apart by endless civil wars.
And you think, okay, it can't possibly get any worse than this, right? Wrong. Just look at this number. Let it sink in.
That's the estimated number of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war who were massacred by the invading Japanese army in just 6 weeks during the rape of Nanking in 1937. This was it. The full-scale invasion by Japan was the absolute rock bottom of this entire 100-year nightmare. It was an atrocity on a scale that's just hard to even comprehend.
But it's right here, in this moment of absolute deepest darkness, that something finally starts to shift. All of this unimaginable suffering started to forge something new, a new kind of unity.
You see, the sheer brutality of that long 8-year war against Japan created a shared purpose that wasn't there before. Finally, they had a common enemy, and that hatred did what nothing else could. It started to bring the Chinese people together. Even the two bitter rivals, the nationalists and the communists, hit pause on their own civil war to fight the invaders. You could say that a modern Chinese nationalism was literally forged in the fires of that war.
And this all leads to one specific day, October 1st, 1949. After the war with Japan, the civil war between the nationalists and communists kicks off again. The communists win, and their leader, Mao Zedong, stands in Tiananmen Square and makes this simple but incredibly powerful declaration.
And that moment, right there, marks the official end of the century of humiliation for China. After 100 years of being invaded, carved up, and pushed around, the country was finally whole again under one government. The bleeding had finally stopped.
Okay, but that just leads to the next absolutely incredible question. How on earth does a country go from being that broken, that poor, that exhausted in 1949 to the global economic superpower we see today? The answer is probably not what you're thinking.
Because years later, the man who would truly launch China's economic miracle, Deng Xiaoping, gave this really surprising piece of advice. He told his people to learn from the world, but most of all, learn from Singapore. That's right, the tiny city-state of Singapore.
And that incredible story is exactly what we're going to unpack in part 2 of this explainer. How one tiny island nation gave China the blueprint for what is maybe the single greatest economic comeback story in all of human history. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll see you then.
Got boosted? Feeling inspired? Brain still hungry? Here are some booster for you.